I have spent my life in the shadows of the wealthiest people on earth, pouring their wine and keeping their secrets. Today, you and I are going to walk through the real Onassis story. Forget the images of Jackie Kennedy on the deck of the Christina O. Before the Marvel yachts, there was just a boy in Smyrna, a busy Turkish port city at the turn of the 20th century. His father traded in tobacco, shipping leaves across the Mediterranean. Young Aristotle watched the relentless rhythm of money. He saw fortunes made and broken on the docks. That was his classroom. He learned the brutal mathematics of survival early on. If you appreciate hearing this hidden history, be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. You learn a lot about a man by looking at his deepest fears. For my master, it was the fire of 1922. When the army retreated, Smyrna burned to the ground. Overnight, his family lost everything. They went from dining with silver spoons to clutching rags in a refugee camp. The master fled to Buenos Aires as a displaced 17-year-old with nothing but the clothes on his back and a terrifying hunger. He took a job working the telephone switchboards in Argentina, secretly listening in on the calls of diplomats and traders. As a servant, I understand the incredible power of eavesdropping. While the world thought he was just a nameless operator, he was taking mental notes, learning exactly how empires were built, how the rich spoke, and how power was truly wielded. He refused to stay at the bottom. The master took what little he knew, the tobacco trade, and started blending Argentine leaves with fine Greek varieties. He sold a taste of home to displaced immigrants who missed the sea. It was a brilliant move. But watching him over the years, I realized his relentless drive was never just about money. He was terrified of ever being that helpless refugee again. The luxury we staff maintained for him later, the crystal glasses, the private islands, was all just theater. More importantly, it was his armor. Every ship he bought, every mansion we cleaned, was another thick brick in a fortress built to keep the memories of poverty out. He was forging himself into a diamond under the crushing pressure of his past. The man who emerged into high society was sharp, polished, and completely ruthless. The origins of his empire remind us staff that grand palaces are usually built on deep wounds. Behind every marble facade I polished, there was a hidden story of brutal survival. That foundation of hunger was his greatest strength, but it eventually became the curse that fractured the family. When the master looked over a harbor, he didn't just see boats, he saw floating kingdoms of steel. He didn't inherit a fleet like the soft old money dynasties of Europe. He started with absolute scraps. He knew the world was about to run on oil, and oil was worthless if it couldn't move across the water. While the aristocrats clung to their traditions, my master saw the future of tankers with terrifying clarity. His first freighters were rusting things that any respectable company would have scrapped. Absolute junk. The established lords laughed at his metal fleet. But the ocean doesn't care if a hull is pretty, as long as it holds cargo. During the Great Depression, when terrified men hoarded their cash, my master spent aggressively, buying discarded ships for pennies. He knew the bigger the tanker, the cheaper the oil per barrel. Soon, he commissioned massive vessels that dwarfed the competition. Then came his real trick, registering ships in Panama and Liberia to dodge the crushing taxes of Britain and Greece. The old money families sneered at him, calling his methods dishonorable. But from my place quietly serving the drinks, I knew he was playing a ruthless game they were too proud to win. I remember standing in the shadows of his study, holding a silver tray while he paced. He wasn't like the old money gentlemen I used to serve. Those men sat in leather chairs, terrified of losing their inherited fleets. My employer was a gambler. I watched him negotiate on the phone with Saudi kings, using a mix of charm and raw nerve that made me hold my breath. He didn't just want a contract, he wanted the ocean. I would follow him to the shipyards, carrying his coat. He never cared about ruining his shoes in the oil and salt water. He would run his hands over the welded steel of surplus ships he bought from the Americans after the war. While rivals calculated risks, he was out in the dirt, doubling down. Stick with me, You and I are about to see exactly how a hungry man takes over the world. By the 1950s, I was pouring drinks aboard the grandest vessels on Earth. He controlled one of the largest private fleets in the world, moving the oil that powered entire nations. His tankers were floating castles. Every time we pulled into port, I saw crowds staring in awe. It was pure theater. The ocean was his canvas, and those ships bought the mansions and the famous romances. But long before the yachts, he was just a hungry newcomer in Buenos Aires during the 1920s. The older staff used to tell me stories about those early days. They spoke of crowded, noisy cafes humming with ambitious voices, where waiters in crisp white jackets served bitter coffee, and heavy cigarette smoke hung in the air like thick ribbons. He had nothing back then, but he was already watching, planning, and waiting for his moment. They say he sat at those cafe tables, carrying himself like he already owned the city. He had empty pockets, but he had sheer presence. He wore cheap suits with such absolute confidence, you would swear they were tailored in Paris. I saw that same magnetic pull years later. He would lock his dark eyes on powerful men and completely disarm them. Every handshake was an investment. As the money flowed, his wardrobe shifted. A finer wool on his lapel, a heavy gold watch catching the light. By the 1930s, I was packing his trunks for Monte Carlo and Paris. He was no longer just an immigrant. He was a magnate stepping out of luxury cars, hosting dinners where the champagne never stopped. We were crashing into high society, a world that loved his money but whispered behind closed doors, deeply suspicious of how fast my employer had risen. Those old aristocratic families were used to polite inheritances, not a man who built an empire from scrap metal. I used to stand by the salon doors, watching him break all their unspoken rules and still win the game. He wore their tuxedos, but kept his rough outsider edge. When he bought into Monaco, he wasn't just talking with princes, he was conquering their territory. Then came the yachts. I spent evenings serving champagne on decks overlooking the Mediterranean, watching him act as both host and mythmaker. He made guests feel like part of a legend. And of course, there were the women. Long before the opera divas and famous widows, I saw how he operated. He knew that walking into a crowded ballroom with a high-profile companion didn't just turn heads. It was a calculated move that elevated his status and cemented his absolute power in their eyes. In his world, a companion was pure social capital, opening doors his checkbook couldn't budge. He bent rules, found loopholes, and drove regulators crazy. Yet high society couldn't look away. Old money preferred quiet estates. My employer was a flashing neon sign. I remember brushing his jackets while photographers camped outside our gates, following him from the boardroom to the beach. He understood early on that image was just as lethal as cash. To be rich wasn't enough. He needed to be viewed as untouchable. He built his empire on cold steel, but painted it with silk and spectacle. You and I can see the truth of it now. The penniless boy who used to eavesdrop on telephone lines had grown into a titan. And I was right there in the shadows, pouring wine for kings, actresses, and magnates while he quietly ran the world. I polished those parquet floors until they mirrored the gilt-framed ceilings. I stood by the sweeping staircase, a ghost in a uniform, watching Mr. Onassis orchestrate his own legend. You and I both know people do not just stumble into a life like this, they seize it. He was a refugee from Smyrna who once counted cigarettes to survive. Yet here he was, commanding a Mayfair mansion in Grosvenor Square. It was not just a home, it was a tactical strike on old money society. I opened the doors for dukes, bankers, and ambassadors, taking their coats while they murmured his name. And then there was Madam Jackie Kennedy Onassis. I poured tea as she and her sister, Lee Radziwill, wove that Kennedy mystique right into the fabric of European aristocracy. The house was like a perfectly cut tuxedo, quiet and dangerous, but the moment the evening began, all restraint evaporated. My hands would ache from carrying silver trays of crystal glasses, weaving through champagne towers that caught the light. I watched from the shadows as jazz spilled into the drawing rooms. The guest list I helped manage read like the elite columns of the Times. But the gravity of the room always shifted when Jackie entered. She was magnetic, wearing her tragedy like an armor. They came for his wealth, sure, but they stayed to stare at the woman who once commanded the White House. Along with her sister, they turned our halls into a royal court. Yet, behind the velvet curtain, I saw the quiet moments. I brought warm milk to Christina and Alexander. For them, this fortress was their only solid ground. Miss Christina would sometimes sit by the great windows, entirely eclipsed by her father's massive shadow. Mr. Onassis used this house like a chessboard. I cannot tell you how many massive shipping contracts I saw finalized over a simple plate of roasted pheasant. This Grosvenor Square address was his ultimate weapon. If I let you through the front door, it meant you mattered. But here is the brutal irony I witnessed every single night. He owned the stage, but the old money aristocrats never truly accepted him. I heard their cruel whispers as I poured their wine. They mocked his loud voice and ruthless ambition. But he knew. He simply did not care. Madame made sure his name was the only one that mattered. It was all a grand performance. Power disguised as grace, tragedy spun into gold, and we servants were just hands shifting the props. Things were entirely different across the ocean. When we arrived at the Fifth Avenue apartment in New York, the tactical maneuvering stopped. This was Madame's true sanctuary. After the president was killed in 1963, she became the most hunted widow on earth. I spent my days turning away reporters and managing the perimeter so she could breathe. The Manhattan apartment was completely stripped of the heavy European gold. It was a quiet fortress of pale fabrics and carefully selected art. I used to stand by the windows looking out over Central Park, watching her walk alone beneath the autumn trees. That park was her buffer against a city that wanted to consume her. Inside these walls, there was no performance. She was not a symbol of Camelot here. She was just a mother, surrounded by her books, finally allowing herself a moment of absolute stillness. I made sure the space felt like an impenetrable retreat. For young Caroline and John Jr., this was the only steady ground they knew amid endless flights to Paris or the Greek islands. When Madame married Mr. Onassis in 1968, the world called it a betrayal. I read the vicious papers before tossing them into the incinerator. But she never abandoned her roots. Even when the boss came to town, using the apartment as a sleek base of operations for his American deals, everyone knew whose territory it really was. I took my orders only from her. Fifth Avenue had always belonged to the old guard, the Vanderbilts and the Astors. But Madame conquered it quietly. She brought the ghosts of the White House and the fierce survival instincts of a woman starting over. I watched her rewrite the rules of power, not with a roar, but with a quiet, devastating elegance. You and I only saw the glossy magazine covers, but I was the one opening the heavy oak door of her Fifth Avenue apartment. I would take her coat and watch her shoulders finally drop. Out on those New York streets, she was safe. The famously cold locals gave her space. I often watched from the parlor window as she walked the children through Central Park. No security entourage, just a mother in dark sunglasses. This apartment was her anchor. After the chaos of Washington and the blinding sun of Skorpios, this was the only place the world stopped spinning. She survived unspeakable tragedy to become a global symbol, but inside these rooms, she was just a person. My entire job was to keep that urban sanctuary completely untouched. I was there in 1963 when Mr. Onassis purchased Skorpios. Let me tell you, it was nothing but jagged rock and dead scrubland in the Ionian Sea. I remember standing on the dusty slope, thinking the boss had finally lost his mind. But he saw a miniature empire. He ordered us to bring in massive barges of fertile soil from the mainland. We worked for months, planting thousands of olive and pine trees exactly where he pointed his walking stick. We even hauled in tons of white sand to carve out artificial beaches. The man was literally rewriting nature. I watched engineers blast the rock to lay water pipes and power lines until grand marble villas rose up from the dirt. He was building his own Mount Olympus, a private kingdom where he bowed to absolutely no one. The island quickly became his personal stage, and I was the one pouring the champagne. The guest lists were staggering. I stood by the altar in 1968 when Jackie married him, listening to the soft rustle of her white Valentino gown. The whole world was watching, but to us on the staff, it was a daily routine of serving the elite. We ran a private Versailles. I served drinks to Maria Callas and brought cigars to Winston Churchill under the stars. The boss used the island as a fortress, controlling every single detail of who entered. But behind the glittering facade, I saw the shadows. I often found his daughter, little Christina, sitting completely alone by the gardens while the orchestra played. For her, this gilded paradise was nothing but a beautiful prison. Years later, Miss Christina would sit in the parlor and confess how crushing that island's loneliness truly was. Despite all the spectacular company we hosted, the air was thick with quiet tension. Yet the world only saw the miracle of Onassis wealth. He looked at barren rock and demanded a miracle, forcing us to build it by hand. The bitter irony is that the symbol outlived the man. After he passed away in 1975, the property slipped from his heirs and was sold off to new billionaires. But his ghost never really left. If you walk those artificial beaches today, you are walking entirely in his shadow. I still recognize the exact placement of the exotic trees we planted for him. That island was not just bought. He imposed his fierce will on the earth itself. Come with me to the docks. If you thought the island was arrogant, you should see his ship. The Christina O was a floating empire, and I spent years working its decks. It started as a battered Canadian war frigate. Men saw rusty scrap metal, but the boss saw a canvas. He made us strip the heavy steel bulkheads to build a palace of pleasure. At over 300 feet long, it was an absolute monster. We installed Italian marble and a massive pool that I could turn into a dance floor with one push of a brass button. I poured whiskey in the library for Mr. Churchill while Marilyn Monroe leaned against the teak railings outside. For the guests, it was a glamorous passport into high society. For the staff, it was the exhausting, glittering center of the world. I spent years serving on the Christina O, and let me tell you, that yacht was a floating chessboard. Mr. Onassis hosted Winston Churchill and movie stars, trading their fame for a taste of his wealth. He named the ship after his daughter, though she mostly grew up hiding in the shadow of his spectacles. His oil tankers made the billions, but they were faceless. This yacht was his soul. The famous swimming pool could actually rise over a Minotaur mosaic, turning a swim into a gala, pure theater. Down in the salons, I poured champagne while men whispered deals that shaped the world. The secrets I swept up with the empty glasses could burn down empires. To the press, it was just vulgar excess. But to those of us carrying the silver trays, it was a masterclass in raw power. I remember when the world saw those photos of Jackie Kennedy sunbathing on our deck. Critics called it an immigrant's overcompensation, but others saw pure brilliance. Even today, they say the yacht is chartered to people desperate to touch the history we lived. But paying guests will never catch the ghost of Churchill's cigar smoke, Maria Callas singing, or the soft click of Jackie's heels. Calling it a mere yacht is an insult. It was a floating empire of teak and marble where Mr. Onassis made the sea his personal stage, and then came his ultimate prize, the marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, America's grieving First Lady and my brash, controversial boss. It was a collision of two entirely different worlds that left every steward and deckhand holding our breath. When she stepped aboard in 1968 in that Valentino gown, the papers screamed betrayal. They wanted her to be the weeping widow of Camelot forever. But standing guard outside her cabin, I saw what the reporters missed. I saw a mother terrified for her children. After 2 assassinations, she was hunted by her own fame. My boss offered the one thing she needed most, a fortress. We had private islands, jets, and men like me keeping the chaos out. For her, it was a tactical retreat. And for Mr. Onassis, I watched his chest swell that day. He had billions, but the old European families still saw a vulgar outsider. Marrying America's queen changed all of that. He bought his way into a glamorous dynasty, securing a legacy no rival could ever touch. I poured the wine, so I had a front-row seat to the war. Mr. Onassis expected absolute obedience. His past women simply smiled and looked away. But Jackie was a former First Lady with an iron spine. The cultural clash was deafening. She was quiet American elegance and soft conversations. He was booming laughter, thick cigars, and shouting over opera singers. Two storms colliding. Then there was Maria Callas. The diva was devastated, but my boss never truly let her go. I heard his hushed phone calls and saw the painful toll the gossip took on Jackie's face. Yet it wasn't always a battlefield. Sometimes, while clearing plates late at night on Skorpios, I would catch them sitting quietly in the ocean breeze. In those rare moments, you could see his genuine awe for her grace. I poured the wine during those agonizing silences at the dinner table. Madame appreciated the master's wealth, knowing it shielded her and the children from a cruel world. He was their fortress against the flashing cameras. But if you were there with me, serving them daily, you would have seen the cracks widening. I watched Madame retreat into her books, a mask of cool independence, while his volcanic temper shattered the quiet. It was no fairy tale. It was a carefully negotiated truce. To the public, they were colliding symbols, the tragic widow and the Greek titan. But clearing their plates, I saw only two exhausted people trapped in an unrelenting spotlight. That iconic image on the deck with his cigar? A beautiful, necessary illusion. Polishing silver in those massive, empty rooms, I felt the shadows hanging over the family. The world saw glittering yachts and Mayfair salons, but behind closed doors, the dynasty was quietly unraveling. I remember the master's children from his first marriage, Alexander and Miss Christina. They were gilded heirs, yet profoundly isolated. The master's presence loomed over them like a storm cloud, impossible to escape. Poor Alexander carried the heaviest burden. His father demanded a ruthless successor for the shipping empire, but the boy only ever wanted to fly. I would hear them shouting behind heavy oak doors, the father demanding obedience, the son desperate for freedom. Then came that terrible day in 1973, a plane crash. 24 years old. The news echoed through the halls and utterly broke the old man. I watched a titan wither before my very eyes. After the crash, the master's booming voice faded to a whisper. His broad shoulders slumped as he walked the corridors. All his fleets and billions could not bribe fate, and the empire he built to outrun his own ghosts began to crack. And then there was Miss Christina. I often found her wandering the palatial estates, burdened by a crushing loneliness. She was remarkably sharp, yet so fragile. I packed her trunks for 4 separate honeymoons, and unpacked them after 4 bitter divorces. The papers called her a spoiled heiress, but I knew a girl who would have traded every vault of gold for a single day of peace. Madame's arrival only made the tension worse. Miss Christina was fiercely loyal to her father, and she watched the new American bride with deep, unmistakable resentment. Miss Christina never hid her disdain. She viewed Madame as an intruder who only brought more flashing cameras to our gates. The tragedies came relentlessly after that. I stood near the master's bedside as his health failed, until he took his final breath in 1975. Overnight, Miss Christina inherited a global empire she never asked for. She was barely 30, a fragile soul drowning under the weight of corporate fleets. I watched her move frantically from Paris to New York, desperate to find a house that actually felt like a home. She once confessed she was a prisoner of her own bank accounts. When the news arrived in 1988 that she had died alone in Buenos Aires, at just 37, the silence in the manor was absolute. The great dynasty had vanished, leaving only little 3-year-old Athena. It broke my heart, seeing an empire reduced to a single thread. People envy the rich, but clearing their untouched meals taught me a harsh truth. Gold cannot barricade a door against grief. If anything, the wealth only made their weeping public. To escape that suffocating noise, Madame retreated to the rolling hills of New Jersey. I used to pack her bags for Somerset County, a quiet world of polished saddles that felt galaxies away from our Greek island. Out in horse country, she finally allowed herself to breathe. I would lay out her riding gear, knowing this was her true sanctuary. She had ridden since she was a little girl, and out in those endless fields, holding the reins, she possessed both total control and absolute freedom. The horses understood her silent language far better than any of us ever could. When she bought the estate in Peapack Gladstone, I went to manage the house and saw a totally different woman. The public knew the tragic widow or the yacht wife. But in New Jersey, she traded silk gowns for dusty riding boots. The house was grand, but nothing like the glittering traps of Skorpios. The stables were her true sanctuary. I watched her brush the horses, finding peace in the quiet work. For a woman whose life was hijacked by assassins and flashbulbs, sitting in that saddle was the only time she held the reins to her own fate. You must surrender to a horse's power, yet still guide it. That was how she survived her chaotic life. The estate became a safe haven for Caroline and John Jr., too. They could finally sprint across the open grass, completely free from the relentless, heavy gaze of the city streets. I always noticed the shift in Madame when her car reached Peapack. In Paris, I served a guarded queen, but here, her shoulders finally dropped. For young Master John, it was a slice of normal boyhood, mud tracked across my clean floors and laughter echoing through the barns. Madame found peace in a place where horses mattered more than headlines. To Mr. Onassis, the estate was just another line on a ledger. He never truly understood it. But to her, it was a sanctuary free of his heavy control. I would watch her ride out into the fields, not as an icon, but simply a woman breathing the fresh air. It might be a footnote compared to the sheer wealth of Skorpios, but this farm was her escape. Away from the flashing cameras, she remembered who she was before the spotlight. Her horses always gave her rhythm when her life felt like a chaotic spectacle. Later, she brought that same need for quiet freedom to Redgate Farm on Martha's Vineyard. When she bought those 340 acres in 1979, I knew she was finally writing her own rules. It wasn't like the heavy gold salons or the perfectly manicured lawns I used to tend on Skorpios. The beauty here was raw. The Atlantic Ocean crashed against the dunes, and I would watch deer graze in the wild meadows. She had lived in gilded cages her whole life, but here she could walk the stone walls without dodging a single camera. She happily traded the scent of expensive cigars for salt spray and pine needles. But knowing Madame as I did, she would never settle for mere rustic simplicity. I spent months managing deliveries as she transformed Redgate Farm. She replaced the old house with a bright New England estate. My instructions were clear. Every room had to be classic and purely comfortable. I helped tend the gardens, mixing wild blooms with her elegant favorites. It felt like the sum of her life, the breezy Kennedy romance of coastal summers, paid for by the vast Onassis fortune. For the children, it was a rare taste of normal life. I used to build bonfires on the beach while Mr. John surfed and Miss Caroline rode across the dunes. Madame would sit by the fire, laughing more freely than I had ever seen her back in Greece. This quiet Massachusetts retreat anchored her firmly back into the American story. It gave her the one luxury she always craved: absolute privacy. I remember the day she first walked the dunes at Redgate. Not as the tragic widow the world obsessed over, nor the glamorous bride in her Valentino silks. Just a woman in worn jeans, salt spray in her hair, seeking a shield from the noise. Mr. Onassis had his island, Skorpios, a manufactured paradise where he imported sand and controlled the trees. I served drinks there. It was pure theater, built to project dominance. But here on Martha's Vineyard, she didn't want to tame the wild. She let the meadows grow high and accepted the relentless power of the sea. She bought this land to disappear, to carve out a quiet corner where she could finally breathe. My job was simple: keep the gates locked, sweep the wooden porch, and let her fade into the anonymity she valued more than any diamond. Stick with me. This is where the contrast really hits you. By the time she passed in '94, Redgate was her true legacy. It wasn't Camelot, and it certainly wasn't Skorpios. It was strictly hers, rooted in quiet continuity. But then you look at Mr. Onassis, I poured his coffee for years, and I can tell you he was no old-world gentleman. He was a predator in a tailored suit. While she sought peace, he thrived on chaos. He saw the world as a machine, and his genius was finding the bottleneck. Oil was the blood of the modern world. Armies and empires needed it to survive. But sitting in a desert tank, it was useless. It had to cross the ocean. He didn't care about digging for it. He just wanted to own the only bridge that could carry it, squeezing giants for every cent. I used to stand quiet in his study, emptying ashtrays while he dismantled monopolies. He realized that whoever controlled the biggest ships controlled the oil. So he built Titans. Tankers so massive they made rivals look like toy boats. His logic was cold and brilliant. Bigger ships meant cheaper barrels. If Western giants blocked him, he bypassed them. I remember the uproar when he went straight to the Saudi king for exclusive transport rights. It was pure audacity. The establishment eventually crushed the deal, but he proved a single man could terrify empires. Then came the flags of convenience. He registered fleets in Panama to dodge heavy taxes and strict labor laws. Critics called him dishonorable. A few years later, they all copied him. His real weapon, though, was timing. During the darkest days of the Depression, I watched him buy up rusted hulls for pennies. After the war, he scooped up surplus American ships like spare change. He treated global panic as his personal shopping season. But what truly frightened people was his charm. You and I have probably met men who can shift their personality, but he was a masterclass. I'd serve him drinks when he hosted diplomats. He was all velvet and grace. An hour later, crushing arrival, his gravelly voice carried absolute menace. The Christina wasn't just a yacht, it was his favorite trap. He'd host politicians, blurring the line between a vacation and a high-stakes shakedown. He knew people craved spectacle, weaponizing his lifestyle to get what he wanted. The man lived in a constant storm of lawsuits and bitter feuds. And the crazy part? He loved it. I never saw him more energized than when backed into a corner by investigators or trading blows with narcos. Confrontation wasn't a risk. It was a tactic to keep enemies off balance. He was the ultimate paradox. He revolutionized global trade, but ruthlessly exploited every loophole. He was like a chess player who, when about to lose, violently reshuffles the board. He won because he played by rules no one else was willing to write. His empire wasn't just built on steel ships and oil barrels. It was built on sheer, unyielding nerve. I spent years watching him rewrite the laws of the world from the shadows of his dining room, holding an empty silver tray. Working for Mr. Onassis meant watching a parade of rivals walk through our doors. A massive fortune never sits quietly. I served drinks to men who would smile, shake his hand, and hide a knife behind their backs. The most dangerous guest was Stavros Niarchos. If my boss was a loud thunderstorm, Niarchos was smooth ice. They were like two wolves circling each other, fighting over ships, contracts, and women. When Niarchos married into the same Greek family as Mr. Onassis's first wife, the feud turned fiercely personal. I remember pouring wine while the boss raged about Niarchos building giant supertankers just to outdo him. They happily burned money just to wound each other's pride. Even governments got dragged into their wealthy games, making my daily life managing his grand estate incredibly tense. Sometimes, folding his heavy suits, I realized he wasn't just a businessman, he was a shadow king. The Americans never knew whether to rely on his oil fleets or arrest him. I would usher lawyers out the front door, only to welcome royalty through the back. Stick with me, this is where it gets interesting. He used my silver service as a weapon of diplomacy. I poured whiskey for Winston Churchill on the yacht, watching the boss charm the people who mocked him behind his back. Aristocrats drank our champagne, looking down their noses, but they never refused an invitation. Maria Callas tried to bring him into high society, but they always viewed him as a crude intruder. Even when Madame Jackie finally arrived with the golden Kennedy name, the whispers in the servants' hall never stopped. We all knew it was a grand transaction. I poured his coffee while he laughed at the morning papers. Even his closest friends watched him like a coiled snake. But the master fed on that danger. Rivals like Niarchos and sweating politicians were just whetstones to sharpen his blade against. I often watched him pace the decks, steering his empire into the hurricane, smiling as the wind howled. He needed that threat to feel alive. We polished the marble, but his real fortune was built on the tension of those backroom wars. Then came the cameras. The flashes on the gangway used to blind us. Wealth draws flies. But his power drew the relentless glare of the world. We staff just kept our heads down while magazines feasted on his private life, turning the quiet tragedies we witnessed into cheap public theater. You and I know how this game is played. Serving brandy to Churchill on our deck wasn't just hospitality, it was a tactical strike. The master used our silver trays as armor against a world that once mocked him. But cameras are cruel. I swept up the glass after his fights with Madame Callis, watching her heartbreak become breakfast reading for Europe. When he brought the American widow aboard in 1968, pure chaos erupted. The flashes never stopped. I used to hold the umbrellas low to shield Madame Jackie from the photographers hiding in the brush at Skorpios. Those massive sunglasses she wore weren't fashion. They were a barricade. She was a hunted woman, and we staff became her silent guards, watching her fight the world just for a moment of peace. Today, you and I are going to look past the headlines together. I poured her morning coffee, watching Miss Christina stare at the tabloids. They always branded her the unhappy heiress. Every tear, every failed romance, splashed across the front pages. She once whispered to me she didn't know who she was outside of that ink. The cameras were merciless. I remember the frantic kitchen phone ringing when young Alexander's plane went down. I was there when the old man, Aristotle, collapsed, his legendary strength broken by grief. Yet, on Skorpios, we still served cocktails to movie stars, upholding the glossy myth of perfect wealth. The magazines built our employers into modern Greek gods, only to butcher them for sport when the inevitable cracks showed. I swept up after reporters left, clearing the remnants of their grand acts. Don't be fooled. They weren't victims. Mr. Onassis knew the game. I heard him boasting that he'd rather be vilified than ignored. Madame Jackie was just as tactical. I'd watch her adjust her sunglasses before facing the flashes, wielding her image like armor. They fed themselves to the public to forge a legend. Yet, for a titan constantly moving between jets and yachts, the boss craved permanence. He didn't inherit dusty palaces like the aristocrats we served. He had to invent his own. To walk his sweeping halls or polish the brass aboard the Christina O was to feel his raw ambition made solid. Every room was a calculated spectacle, built to prove that an immigrant had finally conquered the world. He didn't grow up with fine art. I unpacked those crates myself, noting the intent behind every purchase. Skorpios was his ultimate statement. I watched crews import tons of sand and plant thousands of trees until that barren rock became a lush paradise. Dusting antiques in those new villas, I understood the projection. When we served royalty, the marble and chandeliers whispered his message, "This is my kingdom." The Christina O yacht was no different. I spent hours scrubbing the Minotaur mosaic in the pool. Everything, down to the heavy wood paneling, turned leisure into a royal ritual. Even his London mansion on Grosvenor Square felt like a fortress of aggressive new money, planted in the heart of aristocratic power to make the elite bow. The boss collected antiques and portraits like trophies, a flashy mix mirroring his hustle. But when Madame Jackie arrived, the energy shifted. Where he wanted to blind guests with gold, she wanted to soothe them. Serving tea in her Fifth Avenue apartment was different. Muted tones and serene sunlight, an escape from his dazzle. Her sanctuary was Redgate Farm. Sweeping porches and rooms packed with worn books. Cleaning Skorpios felt like maintaining a monument to his ambition. But keeping Redgate Farm felt like guarding her resilience. He bought masterpieces to purchase legitimacy. She curated subtle, modern pieces whispering true intellect. Working for them meant walking a tightrope between his aggressive showmanship and her fiercely protected elegance. Let's look at what they left behind. Decades later, the spaces we kept spotless still fascinate outsiders. Skorpios is sold, and strangers charter the Christina O to touch the history we lived. I know the truth. These places were never just homes. They were stages. Skorpios was a loud kingdom for a magnate playing God. The Fifth Avenue apartment was a hiding place for a woman trapped between dynasties. Every silver spoon I polished was a prop in the story they sold the world. They desperately wanted to be seen, yet were always running to hide. The shipping tankers will rust, and the money will fade, but their myth survives. I spent my life walking their silent fortresses, witnessing two towering figures who forced the world to remember them exactly as they designed it. I spent decades polishing the silver spoons in the Onassis households, the very ones Christina joked she wished were plastic. You and I know that kind of money rarely buys peace. To the outside world, she was the ultimate heiress, raised on gilded yachts and locked inside private island fortresses. I watched her grow up in Grosvenor Square, a sharp child, guarded like a high-value asset. Her father, Aristotle, commanded our staff with the tactical precision of a general. When her brother Alexander died in 1973, I saw the exact moment the entire weight of that shipping empire crashed onto her shoulders. She took the reins with duty, never passion. She possessed everything material, yet I never saw her make a choice that felt truly free. We navigated her life like a minefield of shifting alliances. 4 marriages came and went, each ending in quiet heartbreak behind our doors. From the American banker to the French businessman Thierry Roussel, none survived the relentless barrage of the press. I used to clear away the morning tabloids before she woke, hiding cruel headlines about her weight and exhaustion. She desperately wanted a partner who saw past the billions, but she only ever found suspects. The only true victory was the birth of little Athena. I watched Christina transform in that nursery, deploying all her strength to shield the girl. Despite her depression and the suffocating public spectacle, she held the line, managing the vast family shipping holdings with quiet, absolute authority. I stood in the shadows during her high society parties, watching her force a smile for the flashing cameras. She controlled resources that could buy islands, yet she could not secure a perimeter against her own deep loneliness. The devastating call came in November 1988. She was found dead in Buenos Aires at just 37. The official report cited pulmonary edema, but the staff knew it was the cumulative toll of endless tactical retreats from a hostile world. Suddenly, this massive empire of marble and steel was left to 3-year-old Athena. Christina's true legacy is the hard proof that immense wealth only magnifies human fragility. She lived trapped inside a heavily guarded fortress, scanning the horizon for a simple, ordinary love that never arrived. The sprawling dynasty was suddenly reduced to a single operative, Athena. She carried a name that felt more like a tactical burden than an inheritance. Christina had fiercely guarded her to build a secure baseline of love, but that mission was cut short. After the funeral, Thierry relocated the girl to a secure sector in Switzerland. The extravagant operations on Skorpios were traded for discreet schools and an absolute media blackout. To the public, she became a wealthy phantom. But those of us managing the quiet estates knew she had found an evasion tactic. Like her grandmother Jackie, Athena discovered her sanctuary far off the grid. The rigorous discipline of the equestrian stables became her permanent shield against the suffocating weight of her family history. I watched Athena execute a tactical withdrawal from the family curse through the dirt of the show-jumping arenas. She trained with brutal discipline. The horses did not care about her trust funds. Out there, she was just another competitor taking hard falls. It was the liberation her mother never found. Yet the perimeter was never fully secure. The press constantly probed her defenses, demanding the fate of Skorpios. She countered with absolute radio silence. When she married an Olympic rider in 2005, we staff hoped she had broken the cycle. But familiar battle lines soon reformed. Following quiet legal maneuvers and rumors of betrayal, They divorced in 2016. The vast Onassis fortress remained intact, but its lone heiress stood quietly alone inside it. I spent decades serving this family, watching their shadows lengthen. Miss Christina's pain proved that gold offers zero armor against grief. Then came Skorpios. The old man's island stronghold was a paradise to him, but a heavy liability to Athena. In 2013, she executed a calculated maneuver, selling the island to a Russian buyer, Dmitry Rybolovlev. Some of the old staff called it treason. I called it a tactical retreat. She kept perfect operational silence. Born a target meant to carry an empire, she found her only safe zone in the riding arenas. No grand theater like her grandfather. No tragic spirals like her mother. Just a disciplined withdrawal. You and I have to wonder, can one quiet girl actually outrun a myth this massive? I still walk the empty halls of the main house, but her story is far from over. She is the commander who simply walked away from her own army, turning her back on a massive global empire. She did not want the gilded salons or the endless security details we provided. She wanted the dirt, the sweat, and the absolute freedom of a horse at full gallop. I have watched generations of this family destroy themselves trying to hold on to power. In her quiet, stubborn defiance, she built a completely different kind of fortress. It is not built on spectacle. It is not built on shipping routes or oil money. Her operation is pure, unadulterated survival. Looking back at the tragedies I have swept up after all these years, just making it out alive is the greatest inheritance of all.